Today we'll be reading some actual history from this book, The Capture and Escape, Life Among the Sioux by Sarah L. Larimer. This book was published all the way back in 1870. So today is episode 10 in my series on the attack on Fanny Kelly and Sarah Larimer's wagon train, which occurred in July of 1864. In this episode, we'll finally hear the fate of little Mary Kelly. She was Fanny Kelly's niece and adopted daughter, and Fanny had sent her to escape on her own shortly after they were captured. Fanny Kelly does not reveal the fate of little Mary until near the end of her book, but we are going to read the account from Sarah Larimer's perspective after she had successfully escaped from captivity. This closely follows episode 7 in this series. After revealing the fate of little Mary, she then tells about events that happened to her and other settlers after her escape. She also relates the experiences of several women and children, which she trusts will not be without interest to the reader. In accordance with his plan, Mr. Kelly procured a squad of men, it being unsafe to go alone, and proceeded in search of the lost child. It was now 6 days since she had been left by herself. The squad of soldiers in their search came up to a company of emigrants standing a little back from the road. But alas, too late. The body of little Mary had been found pierced by 3 arrows, and she had been scalped by the ruthless knife. But whose guilty hand shed her innocent blood we can never know, since no friendly eye beheld her after she was seen by the terrified soldiers sitting upon a bluff. When discovered by a traveler, her body lay with its little hand stretched out, as if she had received while running the piercing deadly arrow. None but God knew the agony of that young heart in its terrible extremity, and surely he who numbers the sparrows and feeds the ravens was not unmindful of her in that awful hour, but allowed the heavenly kingdom to which her trembling soul was about to take flight to sweeten with a glimpse of its beatific glory the bitterness of death, even as the martyr Stephen, seeing the bliss above, could not be conscious of the torture below. To the travelers who found her, she was only the mutilated corpse of a murdered child. They could not guess her name or people, but with humane feelings gave her a resting place in the earth, and with the usual precaution in such cases, secured a piece of her dress by which the body might possibly be identified. When these duties were over, and the sorrowing father had had the sad satisfaction of smoothing the earth upon the unconscious breast that had ceased to suffer or be afraid, and to know that the task was done, there they left her in the wilderness, a little grave all alone, far from the happy home of her childhood, and the sisters and brothers among whom she had played in innocent joy. Of all the strange and terrible fates, no one who had seen her gentle little face and its loving sweetness, the joy and comfort of her adopted parents' hearts, would ever have predicted such a barbarous one for her. But it was only the passage from death into life, from darkness into daylight, from doubt and fear into love and endless joy. Those little ones whose spirits float upward from their downy pillows, amid the tears and prayers of broken-hearted friends, are blessed to enter in at heaven's shining gate, which lies as near little Mary's rocky, blood-stained pillow in the desolate waste as the palace of a king. And when she had once gained the great and unspeakable bliss of heaven, it must have blotted out the remembrance of the pain that won it, and made no price too great for such delight. It was the 17th of July, and 5 days since our capture, that we crossed the broad bosom of the North Platte, on our way to Fort Deer Creek. The waters had fallen so as to allow us to go over in a wagon, and as the ripples rose around the horses' plunging feet, it brought the recollection of the time we crossed compulsorily under the command of Indian guides. Then each wave seemed to rise to shut out hope of return, and the wide waters, when we gained the opposite side, lay like an impassable barrier between us and friends. Through our journey back, this river had been a mountain of difficulty to our minds. I realized it must be crossed, but how its deceitful quicksands and changing channel would be overcome had cost us much contriving thought. At last I had determined to wait upon the bank or secluded among the hills, until the water should reach only to my shoulders, and then, with the child on my arm, endeavor to cross by fording. The depth could be ascertained by wading in, and at each experiment, when the water was too deep, return and wait until it appeared less formidable, and so by patient, untiring effort finally reach the opposite side. That was my plan, but heaven in mercy sent an easier crossing, among friends who, though yesterday strangers, were already much interested in our welfare. My husband was prostrated by loss of blood and the effects of his wound, and the news of our return had been so unexpected that he could scarcely realize our safety until he saw us by his side. Though we fervently thanked God for our deliverance from captivity and from dangers which we had passed, it was impossible to avoid depression when we thought of our hapless situation, reduced to poverty in that far distant and barren country, and my husband without health to commence anew. Realizing our forlorn condition, little Frank, with tears in his eyes, said, "Mother, I suppose now I shall never be able to get an education." I installed myself as my husband's nurse, and our unfortunate friend, Mr. Wakefield, too, lay suffering with wounds which afterward proved fatal, though he survived for 8 months. 2 weeks previous to our capture, we had caused Frank to be vaccinated, and the pits were still visible upon his arms and neck. Yet I had entirely forgotten the circumstance, but the quick eye of the doctor detecting the traces of the marks pronounced them smallpox, and ordered our tent to be detached from the fort to prevent contagion. Believing that it was the bite of ants, which in our travels seemed everywhere present, I endeavored to persuade him out of that conclusion, but in vain, and only the commandant's disregard of his order prevented the wounded from being moved to another locality. My fears while in the fort were not entirely at rest, for a number of teepees inhabited by squaws and Indian children were in the garrison, and it was these, together with the soldiers' tents, I had mistaken for an Indian village beyond the river, when we were upon the bluffs. The Indians were now considered extremely hostile all over the country, and no one ventured beyond the limits of the reservation alone, as Indians could be seen lurking among the hills. They had even been so bold as to undertake to drive off the government herd, and the attacking of emigrant trains was now of everyday occurrence. The morning after our arrival at the fort, some squaws were observed beyond the enclosure, signaling as though something was to be communicated. A general fear of the Indians prevailed, and no one desired a lonely ramble from the fort, and to prevent venturesome travelers risking too much, a military order forbidding trains from leaving the vicinity without a certain number of armed men was issued by the district commandant. Immediately after the report of the attack of the train had reached Fort Deer Creek, Colonel Collins, commandant of the military district, ordered 2 companies under command of Captain Schumann and Captain Marshall, 2 brave and daring gentlemen, to pursue and rescue the prisoners, and chastise the Indians in case of resistance. But the distance of 100 miles lay between these 2 forts, and they only arrived at Fort Deer Creek on their way in pursuit of the offenders, the evening we returned. But as there was still 1 prisoner out, the second morning they resumed their march in pursuit of the marauders, and after an absence of 3 days returned, but had not been successful. Alas, misfortune had attended the expedition in the loss of a young and daring officer, Lieutenant Brown of the 11th Ohio Volunteers, who, with a small squad of men, left the main body to prospect the neighboring hills, in quest of the enemy. Coming suddenly upon a band of warriors in their encampment, the lieutenant, rather indiscreetly, ordered an attack, but his men, seeing the futility of opposing such numbers, fled, leaving the officer by himself. Becoming conscious of his dangerous situation, he feigned friendship, addressing the Indians in the usual way, but they were not thus to be deceived, and sent a well-aimed arrow that penetrated his neck, and he fell from his horse. He was reported dead, and with all the speed our men could command, they pursued his murderers. But the fresher horses of the Indians carried them off beyond their reach, and the soldiers were compelled to return in disappointment. Stopping to procure the body of the fallen officer, it was discovered that he still lived, and as they approached, he murmured, "Water." His murderers had divested him of his clothes. He had lain 8 hours in the sun with the arrow between the pharynx and the cervical vertebra, in dangerous proximity to his carotid artery. Being left alone and conscious of his situation, it is difficult to depict the agony he must have suffered. He was removed to camp where the arrow was extracted, and he died. His remains were taken to Fort Deer Creek for interment, and thence to his friends in Ohio. The commandant of Fort Deer Creek, Captain Reinhardt, had married an Indian woman who resided with him in the fort. This tawny wife was not beautiful, nor was she amiable, judging from the fearful outbreaks of temper in which she indulged. During her paroxysm of passion, she would come bounding toward him with a knife in her hand, declaring she would cut him into pieces, but generally he could succeed in coaxing her into a good humor. If mild means failed, he would threaten to drive her from his lodge forever, which seemed to be harsh treatment for a husband to his wife. But as it was the only available means within his power, and only used to quell her wrath, having sufficient effect to calm her stormy temper, he appeared justifiable. This unfortunate officer was put under arrest for some minor offense, but was temporarily released, on account of the scarcity of officers. One night, going with a squad of men to reconnoiter for Indians, supposed to be hostile and lurking in the neighborhood, coming upon some lodges among the hills, he dismounted, and ordered his men to shoot the first man that came from a lodge. He then entered, and discovering the occupants to be of the friendly Indians, and they recognizing him as an officer and the husband of a daughter of their people, he made a friendly visit, his men remaining without. But no sooner did he leave the tent than a bullet entered his heart, in obedience to his last command. His remains were taken to Ohio to his friends. His Indian wife grieved sorely and loudly, cutting gashes in her flesh and weeping bitterly, as did her female friends. Soon afterward she became the mother of a son, an unfortunate little boy whose destiny was fixed for the mountains. Some very kind and sympathizing ladies of Fort Laramie believed it to be the duty of Mrs. Reinhardt, his lawful wife, who was at home, to send for and adopt the Indian woman's child, through respect to her husband. Many white men live among these hills having Indian families. They are chiefly Canadian French, but there are some exceptions in favor of our nation. Some of them are adopted into the tribes. Others are traders among them. One in particular, an elderly gentleman called Major Twist, had left his family in New York many years before. His wife being dead, he settled among the hills and married an Indian woman. In his youth he had, it is said, graduated at West Point and received a major's commission, but although a gentleman of refined manners who had been accustomed to a life of luxury, he preferred the freedom of his present associations to the rules of society, and cared for little upon his table except meat. He was aged but not infirm nor bent with years. The sutler at Deer Creek also had an Indian family, and it is said he offered to give any white man of respectability who would marry one of his daughters a very large fortune. While we stayed in this fort, the constant succession of visitors anxious to see a woman and child that had escaped from Indians kept coming in on the arrival of every train. And, with nursing my wounded husband, driving the flies from our unfortunate friend Mr. Wakefield, and attending to the wants of my child, my time was so fully occupied that I could scarcely find opportunity to entertain so many, and answer questions that they asked. Many persons seemed to think that because I had been with the Indians for the space of a few hours, I understood so much in regard to their characteristics. There was a great deal of kind feeling in the garrison, and although help was scarce, we received sympathy and goodwill. One kind young man, a soldier of the 11th Ohio Volunteers named James Lindsay, offered us the loan of $100, which favor was accepted. Dr. Ziegler, the post surgeon, was very skillful and efficient in his care, and my husband was rapidly recovering. The soldiers that had been sent to rescue us, having been unsuccessful in chastising the Indians for the murder of their companion, were anxious to avail themselves of another opportunity, and accordingly were sent against a large party that were encamped near Platte Bridge. But the Indians, proving to be friendly, or so represented by their leader, who was wounded in the affray, the soldiers soldiers returned to Deer Creek on July 27th, and the following day we set out with them en route for Fort Laramie. One of the instances of Indian life related to me by a mountaineer who had traveled extensively in the western slopes of the Rocky Mountains is as follows. Among the Shoshones, or Snakes, is a white woman of surpassing beauty. She is held in much esteem and respect, and often consulted upon matters of importance to the tribe. She was found when quite young near the dead body of her brother, who had fallen in a severe conflict with a grizzly bear and her 2 cubs. It appeared from what she remembered of the circumstances that her father with his family was en route for Oregon when they were attacked by a band of Utah Indians and all destroyed except herself and brother, a youth of about 18 years of age, the attack taking place about an hour before day. While the Indians were plundering the train, her brother, taking her in her arms, sought shelter in a cave nearby. This cave had long been known as a place of terror to the Utes, and their tradition had enveloped it in a cloud of mystery. It was called the Cave of Ghosts, and the Indians carefully avoided its immediate vicinity, thus making it a place of safety for these refugees, who might have remained in its shelter until some immigrants or a friendly band of Indians should rescue them, had it not been for a mortal combat with 3 grizzly bears, which resulted in her brother's death, and thus left her alone to be taken and adopted by the friendly Snakes. The legend of the cave is known to all the Indians and many travelers who have visited Salt Mountain in the Juab Valley. The cave is a remarkable depression in the earth, at the bottom of which is a clear spring of water rising a few feet, disappearing in a porous strata, and then flowing off. The Indians call it Pin Gun. They affirm that in this cave resides a demonic spirit whose form and voice is that of a child. At the sun's decline, it comes up to the surface of the water, and when anyone approaches, it utters the most dismal cries for assistance, at the same time making fearful contortions of suffering. Should any persons approach closely, their lives would surely pay the penalty of their hardihood. It would seize and convey them to the lower regions, to a life of endless torture. The Utes firmly believe in the truth of this legend, hence its name, the Ghost Cave. It appears that these orphans had remained undiscovered for several months in the protecting shadow of this retreat, when the unfortunate circumstance took place, which deprived the brother of his life and left the little sister alone. Starting out one day upon his hunting excursion, after bidding the little girl take care not to ramble out of the thicket which screened the entrance to the cave for fear of discovery, he went cautiously down the canyon, and had not proceeded far when steps behind him arrested his attention. Turning to see what it was, his eyes fell upon a she-bear and her 2 cubs, advancing rapidly upon him. Hurriedly cocking his gun, he took deliberate aim, but missed fire. In another moment she was upon him, and tore him almost to pieces. Then the bear left him, and when he recovered, his sister was at his side, endeavoring to stanch his flowing blood. All night she sat by him, and in the gray dawn of the morning he closed his eyes in death. The weeping child watched by the corpse of her brother, and endeavored to keep at bay the howling wolves that surrounded them, attracted by the scent of blood. She picked up the gun and knife and kept her solitary watch, after loading the gun as well as she was able, in the manner she had often observed her father and brother prepare their weapons for hunting. She only succeeded, however, in getting down a load, but was unable to cock the gun to place on a cap. As she was making the effort, a sharp war whoop rang upon the air, and a tall Indian stood before her with several of his companions. The little girl, knowing the fate reserved for captives, and thinking that they were the Indians that murdered her parents, seized the knife and stood up resolutely in front of the dead body. The Indian, pleased at the heroic attitude of the child, reached out his hand and smiled. For a few moments she looked at him earnestly, then burst into tears. The Indian kindly took her in his arms, and placing her upon his pony, bore her to his people, where she still remains. Okochee, the leader of the Shoshones, was on the trail of some of the Utes, whom he had dispersed after taking many scalps and all their camp equipage with many ponies. With the characteristic superstitious ideas of his people, the chieftain regarded the child as sent by the Great Spirit to his lodge. Under this belief, he loaded her with favors, decorated and clothed her in costly furs, and provided captive maidens from neighboring tribes to wait upon her. She is not allowed to engage in menial employments, but is considered almost sacred. Although many have sought her hand in marriage, and rival lovers from friendly tribes have even crossed lances in combat for her love, she is still her own mistress. The daring trappers and hunters of the Rocky Mountains have braved peril and obstacles to reach her side, but in vain. The jealous chiefs of the band have carefully concealed her remarkable beauty from sight beyond the tribe, and neighboring Indians accredit her with power of assuming invisibility. Thus, this waif of the battle and the wilderness remains a mystery to all, and is known only as the Morning Star or the White Princess of the Shoshones. When en route to Fort Laramie the second afternoon, our encampment was in an extensive grove, and while some of our men were rambling about, several shots were fired at them. Supposing this an attack by Indians, they returned the fire, causing quite a sensation in the camp. Fortunately, the timber provided a shield, and no one was injured. The invaders were travelers belonging to an emigrant train that was corralled just beyond the woods. This company was en route for the Pacific coast, and with it were some aged persons and many children. As we traveled, the following day we saw the body of a man who had been killed by Indians and buried by kind travelers, but now his body had been exhumed by wolves, and it lay by the roadside. We received, through the kindness of Colonel Collins, the commander, the use of a house, and being successful in borrowing some more money, we concluded to engage in the business of photography, and accordingly sent to Leavenworth for the materials necessary. Indian depredations had, however, assumed such threatening proportions that stage travel was considered unsafe, and many obstacles lay in the way of our procuring the appliances of business as readily as we desired. Nearly 2 months elapsed before we received the camera with the appurtenances to commence business. During our stay of 5 years in the far west, we have had convenient opportunity to observe border life and Indian character, the result of some of which is given in these connections, although a brief account of the experience of several women and children who became victims of Indian cruelties, which I trust will not be without interest to the reader. Much has been said of the noble traits of the Indian character, but, notwithstanding, observation has confirmed our opinion that there has been a mistake somewhere. Our respect for lo the poor Indian has been fearfully diminished, and we begin to conclude that familiarity does breed contempt, especially for the forest king. And if the sympathizing friends of the Indian were subjected to a journey across the plains, where a visit from their Indian neighbors would result in poverty and a narrow escape from death, or in a life of bondage, they would probably modify their flattering opinion. On the 8th of August, a train of 12 wagons was attacked on the Emigrant Road at Plum Creek. A Mr. Morton of Denver had been to Sidney in Clinton County, Iowa, where his wife was visiting, while he fitted himself out as a freighter for the plains. In connection with his brother-in-law and 10 others, he set out upon his freighting expedition, taking with them Mrs. Morton and a little son of one of the men from Council Bluffs. When attacked, the train was completely taken by surprise, thus rendering defense useless. All the men were killed, and the woman and boy were carried away. The news of the massacre soon reached Fort Kearney, and a squad of soldiers were sent out to bury the dead, to rescue the prisoners, and also to bring the offenders to justice. This expedition failed of success, though the soldiers encamped the first night inside of the Indians' camp. The Indians had procured from the train several cases of liquor, in which they indulged freely, with the exception of 2 who remained sober to guard the prisoners. In their intoxicated condition, their capture might easily have been effected, but the pursuing officer, not understanding their exposed situation, deemed it prudent to be cautious. When the Indians set out from the place of slaughter, Mrs. Morton was placed upon a horse of vicious disposition, and not being able to control the animal, which seemed to delight in frequent plunges, she was thrown violently to the ground, much to the amusement of the Indians, while for the offense of permitting herself to be thus unceremoniously dismounted, she was violently kicked by a chief. The fall and abuse, together with grief, brought on an illness which caused her to be unable to ride that unruly animal. The chief exchanged her to 2 warriors for 2 horses. They were brothers, the 2 that had been mentioned as being the only sober ones in the first encampment. They took care of her and bore her to their parents, an aged couple living in a teepee by themselves. Their youngest daughter had died a few months before. Mrs. Morton was kindly received as an adopted child, being allowed to remain in the teepee with these old people, receiving the kindest treatment and not being compelled to perform any hard labor. The aged chieftain seemed to pity her, and one day assured her that when he and his wife were dead, she should be sent home to her own people. This was not as satisfactory, however, as she desired, and soon afterwards she solicited a more favorable assurance when he told her that he would someday sell her himself for sugar and coffee. Thus relieved from toil and at rest in mind, her situation was comparatively comfortable. These Indians, as do others, in war move about constantly, their place being here today and tomorrow far distant. When Mrs. Morton was first taken with them, they had with the war party a pretty little girl of about 7 years, whom they had stolen from her home or from some emigrant train. She was an intelligent little creature, but alas, could not understand that her only safety lay in obedience. The child cried continuously for her mother, frequently declaring she knew that the Indians intended to kill her. The Indians admired the little girl and evidently intended to take her to their village, but at length, weary of her continual fretting, a council was held to decide her fate. It was decided that she was unprofitable, and at the close of the council the child was placed a little apart from the others. "I believe they are going to kill me," she cried, as she held her little trembling hands imploringly toward her companion in bondage. "I always feared they would kill me, and I would never see my dear mamma." At this instant a deadly arrow pierced her heart, and she lay dead. The Indians evidently were sorry for what they had done, though conceiving it their duty, and laid her to rest with all the honors due to a beloved one of their tribe. The little boy that had been captured with Mrs. Morton, but 9 years old, felt a strong desire to escape from bondage, and confided his plans to Mrs. Morton, telling her also his intentions for future pursuit. "If," said he, "I can escape, I will return to my mother, who now that father is dead, needs the assistance of her oldest son. But if she casts any reproach upon me for bondage under the Indians, or for my father's death, I will leave her forever." This child was one of the ransomed little captives who died in Denver City. In the winter of 1864, while yet at Fort Laramie, I became aware, through acquaintance with some friendly Indians, of the presence of a white woman in a village 50 miles north of Platte Bridge, and communicated the fact to the commandant, who made other inquiries, and finally offered a ransom for her, when a Mr. Reshaw, an old and wealthy mountaineer, sent his son, a half-breed Indian, to pay their price and bring the woman to his house. This fellow unfortunately rendered himself obnoxious to the lady. She communicated the fact to the aged chieftain, and begged to be allowed another escort. The old man was astonished and angry, and immediately commanded that the white man's son be brought before him. Then, with a contemptuous expression, the old man ordered him to take his presents of sugar, coffee, blankets, horses, etc., and to leave the village. "For," said he, "I will not let the white woman go with you. A man of honor shall come for her, or I will wait until the snows have left the ground, and then carry her to the fort myself." This decision was final, and the mountaineer's son was obliged to return without accomplishing his mission. A few weeks later, another son of a mountaineer went, and after paying $1,700, bore her away to Fort Laramie, where she was hospitably entertained in the family of Mr. Bullock. On the way to Fort Caspar to Fort Laramie, Mrs. Morton saw at Fort Deer Creek an Indian called Black Crow, who had been one of the band that had murdered her husband and the other men belonging to that train, also abducting her. This fact she communicated to the Provost Marshal, Lieutenant Triggs, who immediately sent for the offender. He was taken at Fort Deer Creek, where he had established himself and his family for a winter's support, and brought to Fort Laramie. There he was tried, condemned, and executed with 2 other Indians. On the 9th of August 1864, Black Bear and Two-Face with a party of their men made a raid upon a settlement on Blue River, east of Fort Kearny, killing several men and abducting 2 women and some children. A Mrs. Eubanks and Miss Roper were the unfortunate ladies that were carried away. They were returning from a neighbor's house and discovered the Indians in time to conceal themselves among the tall grass, where they might have escaped discovery if it had not been for the sobs of Mrs. Eubanks and the cries of her infant. They were taken to an Indian village about 100 miles southeast of Denver City, and there they met Mrs. Morton, being permitted to remain together for 6 weeks. But fear of the wrath of the Indians, together with the uncertainty of finding a settlement, discouraged them from any attempt to escape. In the following autumn, Miss Roper and 3 children were ransomed at a fort south of Denver City by the military authorities. The 4 captives being expected at the fort, the commandant went out to meet them, when a dear little girl of 2 years who was tied upon the back of a squaw, as if conscious of her near release and anxious to be restored to the loving care of her own people, stretched out her little hands imploringly. This sight touched the hearts of all who witnessed the scene, recalling to them tender memories of loved ones at home, while tears rose unbidden to many eyes. Mrs. Eubanks, her infant, and Mrs. Morton were soon afterward carried beyond the Platte River and separated. Mrs. Eubanks with her child remained with the Indians until April of 1865, when by a stratagem of the commandant, she was brought to Fort Laramie by Two-Face and Black Bear. These Indians, thinking to increase their fortunes, purchased Mrs. Eubanks and her child of another chief, who held her for a slave. They soon afterwards set out en route to Fort Laramie, and when they arrived within a few miles of the fort, the prisoners were left with a small company, while Two-Face preceded them to arrange the terms of sale. The commander readily agreed to the price they asked, which was $1,000, and on the subsequent day Mrs. Eubanks and her babe were brought in. They crossed the Platte River 5 miles below the fort, near Buvay's ranch, and in the passage of this stream the prisoners suffered intensely. The child was bound upon the mother's back, and she secured to a log, to which the end of a long rope was fastened. The other end of the rope was attached to the chieftain's saddle, and he, passing over, pulled the log of wood along with the prisoners. The chief passed over readily without discomfort, but the mother and child were almost frozen when they reached the opposite bank, as the water was very cold, being covered with floating ice, and the sufferers only having one garment in this inclement season. At the ranch they were dressed, and soon the chieftains proceeded with them to the fort, conducting them to the commander, who, instead of paying the price that had been promised, seized the chiefs and caused them to be confined in the guardhouse to await a trial. Being found guilty of murder, they were condemned and executed, as above stated, together with Black Crow. Before the execution, Black Bear sent a few dollars in money to Mrs. Eubanks, with a message that he had no further use for it, and it might be made useful to her and her child. Mrs. Eubanks remained at Fort Laramie for several weeks until a company of soldiers, commanded by Captain Fouts of the Iowa Volunteers, went down the country. Here Mrs. Eubanks narrowly escaped death by the Indians. A band of friendly Indians who had been living near Fort Laramie were being taken to Fort Kearny, it being regarded as a more suitable place for them. At noon on the first day's march, the Indians became suspicious that some treachery was intended, and that they were being decoyed to their destruction. This mistake may have arisen from some indiscretion on the part of some of the soldiers, who amused themselves by throwing the papooses into the river and watching their dexterity in swimming out. Nothing was said by the fathers and brothers, but their looks toward each other showed plainly that their minds were not on thoughts of peace. Toward evening they affected a desire to hunt, and begged the captain for some powder, which he generously and unsuspectingly gave them. This alarmed some of the soldiers, who requested that a supply of ammunition be given them, but were refused. Soon after, the Indians went out to shoot birds, and on their return said that one of their young men had been bitten by a snake. An old squaw came to Mrs. Eubanks begging that she would go with her to the sick man and endeavor to relieve his sufferings. Mrs. Eubanks, not suspecting any treachery, immediately arose to accompany her, but being cautioned by Mrs. Fouts and others, desisted, and as the Indian recovered, no more notice was taken of the circumstance. When they were ready to resume the journey, the Indians with one simultaneous shout fell upon the soldiers, who, being without ammunition, were unable to successfully resist, and several were killed. The Indians, having succeeded in spreading consternation and death, fled beyond the Platte River. One Indian, however, was chained in a wagon, having been detained a prisoner at Fort Laramie. This Indian fell a victim to the wrath of the soldiers, who took him from the wagon and shot him. On perceiving intimations that they would destroy him, he turned a look of defiance and a scornful smile upon his white captors. When he lay dead, a mountaineer, who had witnessed the whole proceeding, and who was a friend to the Indians, sprang upon the lifeless form, and with one stroke of a knife severed the scalp, offering it to a soldier. Next he cut off an arm, and so continued to mutilate the body till pieces were all distributed among the lookers-on, all the while giving way to vituperation against the soldiers. Captain Fouts, the officer who commanded the execution, had been one of the first to fall. A reason given by some for this unexpected outbreak was a feeling of ill will for this officer. Captain Fouts had been a Methodist clergyman for 25 years before entering the army. He left a wife and several children who witnessed his untimely fate. In the summer of 1864, which witnessed so many bloody scenes in the West, there lived on the Emigrant Road 50 miles east of Denver City a Mr. Morrison and his family, who were startled by the sudden appearance of Indians at their door. When all hope of saving the women and children was gone, Mr. Morrison endeavored to save himself by swimming the Platte River, but was shot while in the water, and his lifeless body floated down with the current. His little boy, an adopted child, was never heard of again. Possibly he now roams the hills amid the surroundings of Indian life. Mrs. Morrison and her infant child of 1 year were carried away. The child died from injuries received from the stamping feet of a chief, who became angry at the disinclination of the little one to play with him when he insisted on being amused. But the mother was ransomed after a year's servitude with the Sioux. Many white women were seen among these Indians. The following narrative reveals the history of one who was the wife of Black Bear, and possibly the same Indian of that name that was executed at Fort Laramie. In the year 1852, an immigrant train en route for California had arrived in the neighborhood of the crossing of the North Platte River, and the cholera breaking out among the travelers, one after another was seized by the epidemic, until all except one little girl died. Black Bear, in hunting, came to the wagons, and received a letter from the hand of the dying father, with prayerful injunctions to carry the dear little creature to his home in the East, where he would be rewarded by the child's friends, in addition to the heavy purse he then gave him. Black Bear then took the little girl and the money and everything left of the train to his home among the hills, and as his views did not coincide with the directions of the dying father, allowed the girl to run about like a little Indian, which she soon became, forgetting her name, language, and family, but she knew she was white. This knowledge she attributed to having discovered in the brook, as she sat with her Indian companions and their images were reflected. But her protector still retained the letter which explained the facts. Arriving at a marriageable age, Black Bear took her for his wife, and when seen in the village she had one child, a little Indian boy, and was, except in blonde complexion, an Indian squaw, submitting to her lot and its savage surroundings. A little boy of 14 years, whose name proved to be Charles Sylvester, from Quincy, Illinois, had been stolen when but 7 years old from his parents, who were at that time in Humboldt Valley, Utah Territory. The knowledge that he was not an Indian but a white child never left him, though he had forgotten his people, language, and even his own name. He had become so domesticated in the habits of the Indians that no fears of losing him ever seemed to occur to them, and he was allowed full liberty. He had been with these Indians 7 years when he escaped, and came to a military station where he had some difficulty in convincing the officer that he was not an Indian boy. Eventually, however, he succeeded in making his story intelligible and was sent to St. Louis, where he was advertised, and it is said his portrait was widely circulated. A gentleman from Quincy, Illinois furnished satisfactory proof that the boy was his nephew and was allowed to take him home. Little Charles proved to be very bright, and in a few months he had acquired quite a knowledge of the English language, learning also to read. His love for his own people, however, was not strong enough to draw his affections from the habits of his life, and the restraints of his city home were irksome to him. Having a hasty temper, he became offended at some remark made by his uncle, and immediately started to join the Indians, among whom he still remains, acting as a trader and interpreter at North Platte City, Nebraska, on the Union Pacific Railroad. There, the noted chief Spotted Tail held his band, and though considered peaceful, was in communication with the hostile tribes. Near Spotted Tail's rendezvous, two little boys were riding together on one horse, when they were pierced by an arrow which entered both, pinning them together as they sat in the saddle. In this condition the little fellows rode home, where the weapon was extracted and, strange to say, they recovered. Near the same place, 3 ladies were captured and carried off. 2 of them were young girls, both named Kennedy, the other a Norwegian. 3 months after their abduction, they were ransomed and brought to North Platte City. So that's it for this episode. Here we finally heard the sad fate of little Mary Kelly. Then Sarah Larimer told several stories that she heard near the time of her capture and escape in 1864. If you haven't seen the other videos in my series on Fanny Kelly, then you can check out my playlist on the attack on her wagon train. We'll get back to Fanny Kelly, who is still a prisoner with the Sioux, in the next episode in this series. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.